Oh, oh my heavens.
Do you believe in mysterious creatures? In the late 1980s, deep in Missouri, a 58-year-old widow named Alma Reeves lived alone in a weathered log cabin at the edge of the Mark Twain National Forest. One autumn morning, her chickens began disappearing. No broken fence, no signs of struggle. Just giant barefoot tracks in the mist. But instead of fear or violence, what Alma saw at dawn was a towering, fur-covered figure standing silently at the forest's edge, watching, not threatening. Most people would have run. Alma left a piece of cornbread and stepped back. That small gesture sparked something no one could have imagined. An unspoken bond between a grieving woman and a wild, nameless being from the woods. This isn't fiction. It's all written in Alma's own journal. After losing her husband in a sawmill accident and her son to heart failure, she found unexpected comfort in what she came to call Ridge Mother. In this video, you'll discover how they exchanged gifts without words, how Alma found pieces of her past mysteriously returned, like a button from her son's old coat, thought lost for years, and most of all, how the forest seemed to understand her sorrow and gave something back. Alma never asked for proof. She offered food, silence, and gratitude. And the forest answered. If you've ever felt grief, isolation, or the ache of something missing, this story may change how you see what's out there. Because sometimes, not everything unknown is meant to be feared. The light had a gold to it that only came near the end of fall, when the maple leaves had gone from fire to ash, and the wind had turned dry as old paper. Alma moved slowly through the kitchen, her steps worn into the floorboards. The cabin was small, held together by habit and nail rust, and the wood stove breathed heat like an old dog resting after a long day. She reached for the kettle, dented aluminum, handle wrapped in faded red cloth, and poured water into the tin pot already lined with dark grounds. The smell of coffee rose like a promise, like memory, like something that almost made her forget how quiet things had become. She didn't need the clock to tell her it was nearly 5. The way the light leaned low through the western window did that for her. She set the coffee to steep, then picked up her notebook. Leather-bound, corners frayed, pages thinned from the pressure of years. A stub of pencil rolled beside it on the table. She flipped to a fresh page, dated it in her careful block handwriting. October 29th. She wrote only 2 lines. No more feathers, no tracks, but the coop is still locked. She stopped, glanced toward the window above the sink. Past the frame of dusty glass, the wood stood still and gold-tipped. Her eyes dropped to the coat rack by the door. A brown canvas jacket hung there, sleeves soft from wear. One pewter button missing. Her fingers twitched to fix it, but she never had. Not since her boy, Caleb, last wore it the week before the river took him. She stood, coffee in hand, and walked out onto the porch. The boards creaked under her boots. She sat on the rocking chair, the one her husband built back in '62 when things were still held together. The wind carried the sound of dry leaves skipping across the hard earth. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a jay cried out, sharp and defensive. Alma sipped her coffee. Her eyes swept to the chicken coop, a squat box of chicken wire and old pine, nestled between 2 sugar maples. She narrowed her gaze. Something had been taking them. Not all at once. Just a hen here, a hen there. Always clean. No blood, no feathers, no broken gate. 3 mornings in a row now. That wasn't a fox, wasn't a raccoon. And it sure as hell wasn't the wind. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped off the porch, the air pinching her cheeks with the early bite of winter. The grass crunched underfoot. At the coop, she leaned in close. Latch still twisted. No sign of tampering. Dirt below still smooth. Too smooth. She crouched, scanned for tracks. There, just beyond the coop, where the light hit a shaded path. She saw it. A footprint. Not boot, not paw. Just the faintest press of a barefoot. Wide, long. The heel slightly deeper than the toes. Alma swallowed hard and knelt down. She stretched her hand beside it. Her fingers didn't even reach the edges. 5 toes, human-shaped, but too large. Much too large. She didn't call out, just looked up, past the edge of the clearing into the trees. Nothing moved, but she felt it. A weight, like being watched by something that wasn't cruel but wasn't known. Not yet. She straightened slowly, wiped her hands on her coat, and turned back toward the cabin. Before heading in, she stopped at the oak tree near the start of the woods. Wide trunk, low hollow near the base. Her grandmother had called it the forest's altar. Alma had made a habit, ever since she started growing her own corn again, of leaving a small cake on its root as thanks. She did the same today, unwrapped a piece of warm cornbread from a cloth and set it gently down. The leaves rustled faintly, not like before, like a breath passed near. That night, she lit the oil lamp in the kitchen, even though the electricity still worked. Habit. The flame flickered against the glass, shadows stretching tall on the walls. She ate in silence, stew still hot from the stove, bread cooled in the pocket of her apron. She reached for her journal again, added a single note beneath the earlier lines. I saw something today. Wind picked up outside. She heard it hit the side of the cabin, rattle the loose corner of the tin roof. But there was something else. Beneath the gust, slower, deeper. A rhythm that didn't match the trees. A breath, not from her own lungs. It came steady, paced, too large for any man. She froze, spoon halfway to her lips, and listened. No footsteps, no scratching, just that. Inhale, pause, exhale. It came from beyond the yard, just past the line where the grass turned to bramble and pine. A place she'd long since marked in her mind as not mine. She stood, heart tapping slow and heavy in her ribs, and walked to the front window. She didn't light another lamp, just pressed her hand to the cool glass and peered out. Nothing moved, no shape, no eyes, but the breath remained, like something rooted just beyond sight, just beyond sound, keeping its distance but not hiding, present, real. Watching, maybe. Maybe not. Just being there. She didn't open the door. Didn't step outside. Just stayed there a moment longer, fingers curling against the sill. She let the curtain fall. Back at the table, she wrote again. Whatever it is, it doesn't want to scare me. She closed the journal, held it in her lap, and stared at the flame. Its reflection danced on the silver rim of the old photograph propped on the shelf. Her husband smiling crooked beside Caleb, holding up a trout the size of her arm. The corners of the photo had curled with time, but the memory still held shape. Strong, whole. The kettle hissed softly on the back burner. The wind moved again, not so loud this time. The breath outside had stopped. Or maybe it was still there, just deeper now, settled into the ground like roots. The room held its silence, and Alma let it. She reached for the coat on the wall, held it in her lap for a minute, fingers brushing the missing button. The pewter one. She hadn't noticed it gone until the day Caleb vanished in the flood, swept down the creek that cut past the far edge of the woods. They'd searched. Dogs, helicopters, the whole damn county. But nothing turned up. No jacket, no boots, not even a shoe. Just empty space and moving water. That was 5 years ago. Tonight she didn't cry. She stood, folded the coat neatly, and hung it back where it belonged. Outside, the moon rose half full over the ridge. The trees breathed without sound. And somewhere near the oak, something old and tall and quiet waited. Not watching, not listening. Just being. as if the woods themselves had decided to remember her. Alma didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but before she went to bed, she lit one last candle, set it by the window. Not to call anything, not to warn, just to say, "I see you, I won't cross the line." And in the silence that followed, no chickens cried, no wind screamed, no shadows stirred. But the breath came again, just once, low, long, gentle. Then it was gone. The cold came sharper at dawn, not with snow, but with a breath that bit through wool and slid into the bones. Alma stepped outside before the coffee had finished percolating. She didn't know why. Habit, maybe. Or something else. The chickens were already stirring in their coop, feathers rustling behind the wire. The sky above the ridge was a color between slate and pearl. The first light caught in thick fog that curled low along the ground. Everything felt muffled, like the earth had drawn in a long breath and wasn't ready to let it out. She stood on the porch in silence, one hand tucked into the crook of her arm, the other gripping the railing, eyes scanning the line where the field gave way to trees. The gnarled oaks, the black firs, the broken stumps left from a storm. 15 years ago, all familiar. But she didn't look for what she knew. She looked for the thing she wasn't supposed to understand, and then she saw her. Not a blur, not a trick of light or swerve of fog. A shape, a form, still and solid, just beyond the sumac brush where the ground began to dip. Broad shoulders hunched forward slightly, arms long, hands low, legs sturdy and half hidden behind thickets. And those eyes, amber, set deep under a heavy brow, not glowing, not wide, just there, watching, waiting. Alma didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She knew that if she moved too fast, or if she let something instinctual grab the reins, it would all be gone. Like a deer, like a ghost. So she did the one thing that felt honest. She lowered her eyes. Not in fear, in recognition. She reached into her coat pocket, slow as dusk, pulled out a small parcel wrapped in flannel. Cornbread from the night before. She stepped off the porch, walked 10 paces across the brittle grass, and stopped just before the land shifted. She knelt carefully, unwrapped the bread, and laid it down on a flat stone beside the gnarled roots of the old oak. Her hands didn't shake, her back didn't turn, but she took 3 steps backward, deliberate, then turned slowly, never looking over her shoulder, and returned to the porch. She sat in a rocker and listened. No branch snapped. No sound moved through the brush. But the presence remained, a pressure just beyond hearing. Not heavy, just undeniable. She didn't write in her journal that morning. Words seemed like the wrong kind of witness. Instead, she folded the flannel and set it on the kitchen counter, then returned to her day like nothing had changed, though everything had. Later that afternoon, she checked the offering spot. The bread was gone. No crumbs, no birds, no drag marks. Just a faint disturbance in the leaves, and something else. A streak of sap across the oak's bark, low and thick, drawn with a heavy hand. Fresh, still tacky. She touched it lightly with her fingers and brought them to her nose. Pine, clean and sweet and old. She didn't smile. She didn't shiver. She just whispered, "I see you," and walked back inside. The next morning there was another signal. Alma rose early, lit her oil lamp before the sun could argue with the dark, and stepped outside with her mug steaming. The fog had lifted slightly, and the first woodpecker call rang out from deep within the trees. At the base of the same oak, right where she'd left the cornbread, lay a small cluster of pine needles arranged in a fan shape. Not random, not wind-blown, intentional. She didn't touch it. Instead, she brought out another offering, 2 eggs, warm from the coop, and placed them gently on a flat rock beside the trunk. This time she didn't retreat quickly. She lingered a moment, watching the way the light bled slowly through the fog, and let her breath rise and disappear in the stillness. she whispered again, not to the trees, not to God, not to herself. Just into the cold. Thank you. Days passed like that. Not every morning brought a gift, and not every dusk brought a sighting. But something had shifted. The air along the porch edge felt heavier, as if the land had decided to fold her into its keeping. And with that came a rhythm, a wordless ritual. Bread for sap, eggs for pine, silence for presence. One evening, after mending a torn apron by firelight, Alma glanced through the kitchen window and caught sight of something she hadn't seen in years. The silhouette, tall, still, backlit by the faintest sliver of moonlight. At the edge of the woods, not hiding, not moving, just there. She didn't reach for a camera. She didn't whisper for it to stay. She lit a candle and placed it on the table by the window. A small flame between them. That was all. That night, she slept with her window cracked. Not to invite, not to dare, just to allow. By the end of the week, the signals had begun to build a language all their own. She returned one afternoon from walking the creek's edge and found, placed beside the porch steps, a smooth stone with a scratch of sap on its surface. Not painted, not natural. A mark, as if left by a nail dragged through resin. It wasn't a symbol she knew, but it was a message, a reply. She held it in her palm for a while, then placed it near the hearth. A few days later, she found the pine sap trail had returned to the oak trunk, only this time it curled slightly downward, like a bow or a nod. Still, she did not approach. She sat on her porch each dusk, listening. She brought out no chairs, no food, just herself, and waited. Once she thought she heard a low grunt, somewhere between discomfort and breath. But when she turned her head, there was nothing. Just the trees. But she'd learned by now that the absence of a figure didn't mean the absence of presence. Then the moment came again. Late in the evening, as she turned the latch on the front door, Alma felt something shift in the atmosphere, like the hush before a storm, but smaller, more precise. She looked back over her shoulder and saw it. The figure, not as far this time, closer to the clearing, but still just beyond reach. Shoulders bowed slightly, arms loose at her side. Still, Alma didn't go to her. She didn't speak. She raised her hand slowly, and the figure raised hers back. Not in mimicry, not immediate. There was a pause, a breath. Then the long fingers lifted, palm open, mirroring. Alma lowered her hand. So did the figure. It was enough. The next morning, Alma woke to the smell of pine stronger than usual, as if it had drifted into the house in the night. She followed it to the porch and saw nothing new at first, until she stepped down the steps and looked toward the oak. There, in the same hollow where she'd always left her offerings, sat a round, hard fruit. Osage orange. Bright green, bumpy, too large to be mistaken for anything else. Out of place. It didn't grow here, not naturally. She picked it up carefully, as if it might vanish in her hands, and turned it over. No mark. No smell. Just the quiet sense that it meant something. She carried it inside and set it on the mantel. It sat there like a stone from another shore. That night, the wind rose again, scraping dry needles along the roof. But the breath did not return. The yard held no sound. The line between forest and clearing stayed intact, the shadow never crossing, the eyes never glaring. Alma lit a single candle and turned out all the other lights. She sat in silence, letting the dark press against the windows. No noise, but not empty, just held. And somewhere beyond the reach of that small flame, something alive stood still, watching the house not out of fear or anger, but out of memory, out of ritual, out of something older than speaking. She didn't try to explain it, didn't write it down, only whispered as she always had, once, into the quiet. Thank you. Behind her, the rocker creaked with the wind. In the woods, no animal called, but there was breath again, soft and measured, drawn deep into the fog and released into the cold. A rhythm, not unlike her own. Then it faded, but not completely, not this time. Under the first hard frost of December, the ground had stiffened like an old man's back. Each step crunched softly in the cold, not with snow, but with frozen layers of leaves that hadn't had the chance to rot. Alma felt it before she saw it. The wrongness, the offbeat rhythm in the silence outside her cabin. It was nearly midnight when she woke. The fire in the stove had died to red breath. The lamp still glowed faint behind its soot-streaked glass. But what woke her wasn't the cold or the dimness. It was sound. A low sound. Not from the trees, not from the wind. Something closer. A pain trying to stay quiet. A muffled groan just beyond the chicken wire. She moved slow. She always moved slow. But this was different. Her breath stayed inside her chest. Her hand reached for the shawl, then the lamp. She didn't turn it up. She carried it low, a glow like the hollow of a lantern pumpkin. Out the door, boots scraping porch boards, she stepped into the brittle night. The trees looked blacker than usual, even against the moon. But the sound came again. Not loud. Just there, not calling, just suffering. Alma crossed the grass toward the fence line, holding the lamp like a child holds an egg. The light was pale gold. Her breath curled from her lips and lifted, catching in the still air. And then she saw her. Not the full frame, not the height she remembered from the edge of the fog weeks earlier, but the bulk, hunched low, leaned against a pine with her legs drawn close and one stretched oddly to the side. The fur looked darker in the lamp's reach. The breath came in bursts, not frantic, just steady, pained. Alma froze at the gate. The figure didn't move. She waited, counted to 3, to 5. The head turned slightly. Alma didn't flinch. She stepped back, turned, and walked quickly, but not rushed, back to the house. Inside, the kitchen became a flurry of gentle chaos. She found the old bucket from under the sink. She poured warm water from the kettle, added a second kettle, boiling fresh. She opened the top drawer. Clean cloths, folded, stored with lavender. She opened the mason jar her grandmother had sealed 40 years ago, the resin still rich with the scent of comfrey and pine. The salve had thickened over the years, but she warmed it in her palm, found a clean spoon, stirred it slowly. Her hands worked like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Then she gathered 2 eggs and wrapped them in a dry cloth. An offering, a peace token, a thank you, maybe a prayer. When she returned to the edge of the yard, the figure hadn't moved. Still leaned against the pine like she was part of it. Alma didn't cross the fence. She didn't ask to come closer. She set the bucket down, folded the cloths neatly beside it, placed the eggs in a small wooden bowl, and laid the warmed jar of salve last. She whispered only once, "This is what I can offer." Then she stepped back, 5 paces, 10, and sat down on the short log she used when planting tulip bulbs in spring. Minutes passed. The sky shifted slightly. Thinner stars, a breeze that came and left without smell. Then Ridge Mother moved. Not fast, not threatening, just adjusted. Lifted her hand, not to wave, not to threaten, to reach the bucket. She dipped one hand in, drew it back, pressed it to the wound at her thigh. Even in the dim light, Alma could see the blood had clotted in patches, but the skin around it swelled and darkened. Not fresh, but not clean either. The long fingers moved to the cloth. She wiped gently, paused. Then Ridge Mother did something Alma hadn't expected. She tilted her body toward the ball, took 1 egg, held it, cradled between thumb and 3 fingers. Not eaten, just held, as if remembering something soft. She set it down again. Then she turned slightly, leg extended, presenting the wound openly. Her head bowed. Alma understood. She rose, took the long cloth, stepped closer, not past the invisible line, but enough. Ridge Mother didn't flinch. Alma dipped the cloth in the warm water, wrung it slow, cleaned around the edges of the gash. It wasn't deep, not enough to show bone, but the skin had split wide, likely from scraping against something sharp, or worse, caught in something made by man. Alma pressed gently, then dipped again. The second time she added a trace of salt to the water. The third, she dried the leg with a fresh towel. The fur was coarse, smelled of pine and old cedar bark. Then the salve. Alma warmed it between her palms. The scent rose sweet and sharp. She applied it without rush, using the flat of her hand, not fingertips. No words, just steady rhythm. Ridge Mother didn't move, didn't look, just breathed. When it was done, Alma stepped back, bowed her head. The egg still sat between them. She turned and walked slowly back to the porch, not waiting to see what would happen next. That night, she didn't write anything. She sat by the window, lamp off, eyes on the dark. Morning came late. Clouds hung low. Wind moaned gently under the eaves. Alma wrapped herself in her thickest shawl and opened the front door. The bucket was gone. The cloths, too. The bowl remained. Inside it was something new, a length of knotted rope, weather-worn, frayed at the ends. But the knot was familiar. A fisherman's loop, the kind her husband taught Caleb to tie when he was still a boy. The kind they used to hang the trout for cleaning. The same kind Caleb had looped around the porch post to keep his bike from sliding down the hill. Alma reached out slowly, fingers brushing the rope like it might vanish. She lifted it, turned it in her palm. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, had found it, retrieved it, returned it. She looked toward the woods. Nothing moved. But the memory stirred hard. The knot had been lost years ago, along with the bike, along with the boy. Somewhere in the confusion of grief and wet spring mud, the knot had slipped into the dirt near the porch, never found again. Until now. She clutched it to her chest, stepped inside, and placed it in the drawer beside the kitchen sink. The next few days were quiet. No more gifts, no more sounds. The wound, she hoped, was healing. The salve, though old, still worked. Her grandmother's hands had known what they were doing. She returned each morning to the tree, left warm eggs, bits of bread, sometimes a small piece of cloth soaked in lavender. Sometimes nothing was taken. Sometimes it was. But there were no footprints, no sounds, no breath. Still, something had changed. Not trust, not yet, but acceptance. That night, when the wind returned and the stars vanished under thick clouds, Alma lit a candle. She placed it on the porch step. Let it burn low. She didn't wait. She didn't watch. She simply said, "Thank you," and went inside. At some point near dawn, a gust of wind rattled the windows. She didn't wake, but outside, the candle had been moved. Not blown, moved, tilted toward the path to the woods. A faint streak of sap drawn across the railing like a signature. Not loud, not clear, but present, and somewhere just out of reach. Someone large and silent walked deeper into the trees, with a leg still healing and a knot returned. Under a sky thick with gray and a sun too weak to push back the cold, Alma stepped onto the porch with the weight of something unsaid pressing behind her ribs. The last few days had passed without sound, without movement, without sign. Not a footprint, not a breath, not even the scent of pine lingering in the air like it used to. Just quiet. She had started to wonder if it had all slipped away, like snow melting into the cracks of memory, leaving behind nothing but the shape of its absence. But that morning, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like waiting, like something holding its breath just past the tree line. The oak stood as it always had, bare arms stretched upward, roots wide and still. The stone where she left her offerings was clean, the leaves around it undisturbed. But Alma knew enough now not to measure presence by what was left behind. The forest didn't leave messages like people did. It spoke in pauses, in restraint, in where something should be and wasn't. She turned back toward the door, her hand on the knob. When she felt it, not heat, not cold, just a presence, like the light had shifted behind her without the sun. She turned her head slow, almost afraid that if she looked too fast, the feeling would vanish. But it didn't. Ridge Mother stood at the far edge of the yard. Not hidden, not crouched. Just there, upright, still, watching. They didn't move. They didn't speak. Alma's heart beat loud but steady. She raised her hand slowly. Ridge Mother didn't mirror her this time. She just remained where she was, like a carved figure placed in the wrong century. Then Alma did something different. She stepped forward. Not far, just 2 steps off the porch. Her boots sank into the soft frost, the crunch barely audible beneath the hush. She paused. The space between them felt like it had shape now, like an invisible field pulsing with questions neither of them knew how to answer. Ridge Mother lifted one arm, not high, not in greeting, just enough to meet the gesture Alma had made. They held the stillness together. Then both lowered their arms in near unison. It felt like ceremony, or something older than that, something carved into instinct. Alma didn't speak. She didn't smile, but her chest ached the way it does when something broken begins to settle back into place. Later, she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The candle burned low beside her. She thought about names. She didn't know what the creature called herself, if she had a name at all. But it didn't seem right to think of her as a thing, not anymore. So Alma whispered into the quiet, "Ridge Mother," not to name her, but to give her a place in Alma's mind. Not like a person, not like a pet, like a landmark, a formation. Something shaped by time and weather and unseen hands. Something you don't claim, only respect. That evening, Alma lit a second candle and placed it on the sill beside the first. The wax pooled fast in the cold air. She watched the flames flutter in the draft like 2 breathing hearts. Across the room, the window fogged with the weight of night. And through it, through the blur and frost, Alma saw her again. The tall form, half-shadowed by the dark. Not moving, not stepping forward. Just there. The light from the candle didn't reach her. It barely touched the inside of the glass, but the outline remained. A witness. Alma stood still for a long time. Then she lit a third candle and placed it between the others. In the morning, she woke early. The sky hadn't begun to shift yet, but the house had a different feel. She dressed without rushing and stepped out with a blanket around her shoulders and her boots unbuckled. The air was wet with the smell of old leaves and the copper tang of moss. She walked to the oak tree with a small offering in her hand. A bit of salted bread, a boiled egg still warm in cloth. She didn't look up, didn't scan for shadows. She just knelt at the base of the tree, placed the food gently on the flat stone, and whispered, "Thank you." Then she stood and turned and made her way back across the yard. It wasn't until she reached the porch that she saw it. On the railing, smeared fresh and still sticky, was a wide stroke of pine sap, laid deliberately, not like something that had dripped. A line, bold, across the wood. She touched it with one finger, brought it to her nose. The scent was sharp and alive. It was a message. Not words, not shapes, but intent. She pressed her palm flat against the mark, left her warmth there, and stepped inside. That night, when she lit her candles, she didn't wait by the window. She sat near the hearth with her hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. The air shifted around her, not with sound, not with movement, but with understanding. Later, just before she turned down the lamp, Alma walked to the back door and opened it wide. The cold poured in. She stood there, letting it wrap around her, listening to the quiet. Then, without thinking, She said aloud, for the first time in years, a name she hadn't spoken. Not in front of anyone. Not even in her own head. Caleb. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't echo. It just hung there, gentle, true, and she didn't feel alone saying it. She closed the door, stepped back inside, and sat again near the candlelight. The next morning, a strange fruit appeared at the base of the oak. Round, spiked, pale green, a single Osage orange. She picked it up with care, turned it over, smelled it, held it close. It didn't come from anywhere nearby. Not naturally. She didn't question it. She placed it beside the stone on her mantel and said, "Thank you." That night, no breath came. But the silence wasn't empty. It felt full, like a room just vacated, like a memory not quite gone. And at the window, just before the frost thickened, a handprint appeared. Large, open, facing in. Under the weight of a sky turned to pewter and a wind that no longer danced but scraped, the forest curled in on itself. Ice had come not as snow but as armor, sealing each branch in glass. The maples bowed low, wearing coats they hadn't asked for. The firs stood stiff, wrapped in invisible tension. Even the crows had grown quiet. At Alma's cabin, the porch groaned beneath the crust of wet sleet, every board stiff with cold. She stood at the door with one hand on the frame and the other clutched around a mug of weak coffee gone cool. Her breath fogged the glass. Her eyes stayed fixed on the far corner of the eaves, where the wind pressed the roof shingles upward and let out a sound like something groaning in its sleep. She'd heard that sound for 3 nights now. She told herself it was just weather, just old wood complaining. But this morning, it changed. It had rhythm. It had breath. The creak came again. Then a heavier sound. A shift in weight. She dropped the mug without thinking. It hit the porch and rolled, trailing brown liquid down the icy boards. She stepped out quick, boots skidding. The overhang above her head moaned again, the whole support beam flexing like a bad knee before it gives. She didn't think. She reached for the rusted crowbar beside the wood pile, shoved it under the beam, and tried to prop it. The wind roared through the trees, pulled the tarp from the stack, sent the split logs tumbling. The beam dropped another inch. The edge of the roof jerked forward, flung a wet sheet of sleet down her back. She gasped, teeth clenched, shoulders hunched under the weight of more than weather. Her arms shook. She wasn't strong enough. Not anymore. She tried again, drove her shoulder under the brace. The wood gave a little, then held. She staggered backward, panting hard, sweat turning cold beneath her scarf. The wind stilled, just for a moment, long enough for her to hear something else, something lower, deeper, a groan that didn't come from timber or nails. It came from the earth. She stepped to the edge of the porch, looked down. The brace had shifted, not her doing. It had been lifted, then set back, and the packed dirt below it bore marks. Not prints, not clearly, but something had been there. Wide-spaced grooves, 4 of them, like fingers, pressed deep into the ground, then dragged backward an inch before lifting. She knelt slowly, fingers hovering over the marks. Still damp, still warm. She reached forward, pressed the edge of her glove to the soil. Her hand fit between the grooves with room to spare. Whatever had done this hadn't broken the wood, hadn't torn the beam away. It had braced it, shifted it just enough to keep it from falling. Not to fix, not to replace, just to buy her time. She sat down on the porch step and stared out at the woods. No movement, no breath, but a presence again. Not the same as before, not ceremonial, not distant, closer now, aware, engaged. She rose without rush, went inside. In the kitchen she found what she needed. A fresh slice of cornbread, baked with the last of the summer corn she'd stored in the root cellar. A pinch of salt, wrapped in wax paper. A nod to the old ways, the farm ways, the ones her mother whispered about but never quite explained. She stepped back out and placed the bread and the salt on the flat stone near the gnarled oak, beneath the branches where she'd left so many quiet offerings before. She didn't say a word, just bowed her head and walked away. By sunset, the beam had settled fully into place. No sag, no crack, just a faint shift in position, a realignment, a touch. That night, the wind didn't howl. It whispered. Through the pine needles, across the window panes, around the corners of the house like a hand brushing against memory. Alma sat near the fire with the old journal in her lap, pen resting against the page. She didn't write. Instead, she watched the candle beside her flicker against the glass of the window. Beyond it, nothing moved. But she sensed something had passed through. Not gone, just gone further. The next morning she went to the oak. The bread was gone. The salt too. But on the bark, new sap, a mark not like the others. Not high, not vertical, but angled, following the wind's direction, as if it too had moved forward. She touched the mark with 2 fingers, then brought them to her chest. Not in prayer, not in fear, just presence. The wind picked up again, tugged her scarf across her shoulder. She stood there, eyes closed, breathing with the trees. But that night, the quiet was too deep. No breath, no scent, not even the low calls of owls. She opened the window before bed. Listened. Nothing. The dark felt hollow, not like peace, like distance. She lit a candle, then a second, and placed them both at the foot of the window. One flame flickered blue. The other struggled. She left them burning. When she woke, wax had run down the sill, but the glass remained cold. No handprint, no presence, only the sound of dripping ice from the gutters. Later she swept the porch. The wind had knocked pine needles loose. They collected in the corners, rustling dry beneath her broom. And as she cleared them, she paused. At the far end of the railing, where the beam had shifted days before, something had been placed. A small pile of stones, not gathered, not stacked, just arranged. A line, then another, intersecting. An arrow? No. A path, not pointing to the woods, but from them, toward the house, or maybe toward the space between. She didn't move them. She let them stay. By afternoon, the sky bruised purple, clouds heavy with unshed snow. Alma boiled water, cooked a small cake of oats and dried berries, wrapped it warm in cloth, stepped out into the silence. She left it near the stones. This time she stayed, waited. An hour, then 2. The sun dipped. Still no sound, until it came. Low, slow, a single breath from the far edge of the trees. Not close, not distant, but enough. She rose, stepped back, and left the path untouched. That night she didn't light a candle. She didn't need to, because when the wind came again, it didn't scrape. It sighed, and the porch didn't groan. It held. Under a low gray sky that seemed welded to the trees, the quiet no longer felt sacred. It felt watched. Alma stood near the front of the cabin, one hand on her hip, the other shielding her eyes from the wind. The last of the snow had melted days ago, leaving behind a hard, cracked ground and the smell of wet iron in the air. A murder of crows had passed overhead that morning, noisier than usual, circling low. That alone would have been enough to make her pause. But what truly unsettled her was the sound of tires crunching gravel at the end of the path. No one came out this way without a reason, and very few people ever came twice. She saw the truck before she saw the man. A battered blue Ford, its tailgate hanging at a crooked angle, rust curling up the sides like frostbite on old metal. The engine sputtered once, then cut off. Alma stayed still. The man stepped out with a grunt, his boots landing heavier than necessary. He wore a canvas jacket darker than the clouds, oil-stained jeans, and a face like a cracked skillet. Sharp lines, old burns, unshaved anger. Buck Kincaid. She recognized him even before he raised a hand that didn't wave. It hovered midair like a threat dressed up as greeting. "Morning," he called. Alma didn't reply. He closed the truck door with his knee and took a few steps up the drive. "You been hearing anything strange?" he asked. "My cousin lost 2 calves last week. Nothing left but drag marks and a spooked horse. Figured maybe you'd seen tracks. You being so close to the tree line." Alma stayed on the porch, one boot resting on the edge of the step. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Strange is just nature you haven't named yet," she said. Buck snorted. "Yeah, well, nature don't usually walk upright and leave prints the size of dinner plates." That settled the air. She didn't offer coffee. He didn't expect it. "Mind if I take a look around?" he asked. "I do," she said. He stared at her like she was hiding gold in the basement. "You always been a bit too friendly with the wild. That's what folks say." Alma's hand didn't move, but her jaw set hard enough to silence birds. Buck shifted his weight. "You see anything, you let me know. Some of us still got livestock to protect." She didn't blink until he turned. The truck started slower than it stopped. When it finally backed down the road, Alma exhaled, long and thin, the breath she'd been holding since he pulled up. That afternoon, she walked the perimeter of the yard, eyes low, steps measured. Nothing disturbed. Not the stones, not the tree, not the gnarled prints from weeks past. But something had changed. The air was tense, bristled. She stopped near the old osage thicket. A bend in the brush caught her attention. Twigs bent, soil disturbed, unnatural symmetry. Then she saw it, a trap. Iron jaws half covered in dry grass, the kind meant to break bone, not catch for show. It hadn't been there yesterday. Her breath locked in her chest. She knelt carefully, eyes sweeping for more. Found another 10 feet away, and another just beyond that. A path laid like a snare, winding along the edge of where Ridge Mother had once stood. Alma didn't touch them. Not yet. She walked back to the house without rushing. Inside, she grabbed her thickest scarf, the one with the worn ends and old coffee stains, and wrapped it tight around her neck. Then she pulled out the wooden box from beneath the sink. Inside were a pair of thick gloves, a rusted crowbar, and a folded linen towel. She added the heavy-handled trowel from the shed and a short length of rope. Then she walked back out as the wind picked up again. The sky was darker now, pushing dusk into the hollows. She knelt by the first trap, fingers working slow and sure, slipping the linen between the jaws to protect her grip. She wedged the crowbar in, applied pressure. The metal groaned. It gave. She kept her breath steady. The trap clicked open like a mouth caught mid-sentence. She wrapped the trap in the towel and laid it gently beside the brush. Moved to the next, then the next. She worked for over an hour. The cold burned into her wrists. Her knees ached in the hard dirt. But she didn't stop. When the last one was closed and stacked, she tied them all with rope and buried them behind the old ash stump. Not forever. Just far enough that Buck wouldn't find them again easy. And when she was done, she stood there in the dusk, the world settling into silence around her. That night she didn't light a candle. She didn't write. She sat at the kitchen table listening to the stove tick as it cooled. She thought about Ridge Mother, about the way her eyes never asked, never explained, about the way she stood just far enough away to be respected, close enough to be remembered. Then Alma did something she hadn't done in years. She took a white scrap of cloth from the drawer, one she'd been saving without knowing why, and tied it to the post on the edge of her porch. It fluttered in the breeze like a whisper, like a surrender, or a declaration, "I don't want war." Then she turned and went inside. The wind rose just past midnight, not sharp, not cruel, but deliberate, and with it came the sound she hadn't heard in days. Breath, low, measured, present, not approaching, not asking, just reminding her that nothing goes unseen. By morning the cloth still hung, slightly damp from frost. But at the base of the porch step, someone had left a pine cone. Not broken, not cracked, laid perfect. And beside it, a single sprig of cedar, tucked gently between 2 stones. Not for show, for understanding. Spring came quiet that year. Not in color, not all at once, but in scent. in the way the earth began to loosen its grip on the frost, in the way the crows changed their call. There was a hush to it, like a held breath just beginning to exhale. Alma felt it first in her knees, a softer ache when she knelt by the coop, then in the trees, where buds dared to press against brittle twigs, and the breeze no longer clawed, it brushed. One morning she opened the front door and smelled moss. That was how she knew. She moved slower now, but not from age, from something else, from reverence, from knowing the line between seen and unseen had grown thinner since winter, since the breath in the dark, since the pine cone and the cedar sprig. She hadn't seen Ridge Mother in over a week, not since the night she left the white cloth fluttering and the forest answered with silence, not absence. But even in that distance, Alma never felt alone. The air held memory. The ground remembered steps. She carried her offerings to the oak in a shallow basket. 2 eggs, warm and speckled, a folded napkin holding cornbread, and a thimble of salt tucked in cloth. She bent slower now, placed them with care, and whispered thanks into the bark. The moss on the tree had deepened in color. The sap trail from weeks ago was faded, but not gone. A trace, like a scar, like proof. That's when she saw it. Not at the tree, not behind the brush. On the edge of her vision, just past the line where the dew clung heavy to the new green. 2 shapes, one large, still as stone, the other, small, wobbly. Alma didn't breathe. The sun hadn't risen high yet. The fog was still clinging to the low parts of the yard, and the light played tricks. But not that trick. That wasn't shadow. That wasn't dream. The larger form stood just past the sumac bushes, shoulder curved forward, knees bent slightly like before. Ridge Mother. Alma knew by the slope of her back, by the quiet she brought with her. But beside her, tucked halfway behind her leg, was another, smaller, thinner, covered in a darker coat that rippled as it moved. It peeked, then ducked, then peeked again. Alma didn't move. Not an inch. The little one stepped forward. Just a half step, a foot in the brush. Then a shift. A glance up toward the taller figure. Ridge Mother didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. She only turned her head slightly. And the little one took another step, into the open. Alma's throat burned. The young one, barely up to Ridge Mother's waist, stood thin and cautious, knees a little too straight, arms dangling at its sides like it hadn't figured out where to put them yet. The fur was patchy in spots, darker along the back, and its face held more shadow than form. But its eyes, those were clear, and they were looking at her. Not past her, not at the ground. At her. Alma didn't wave, didn't smile. She only lowered her head. Not far. Just enough. Then she reached slowly into her basket, pulled out the egg wrapped in cloth, and placed it on the stone by itself. Not beside the bread. Not beside the salt. Separate. An offering. She stepped back, hands open. The young one tilted its head. A flicker of curiosity. Then another glance toward Ridge Mother. Still no signal, still no words. But the message was there. Go if you want. The little one came forward. Careful. Half steps. Arms swinging in slight arcs, as if testing balance against courage. It stopped 3 feet from the stone, looked at the egg, then looked at her again. Alma didn't speak, didn't blink. The little one crouched, long fingers pressing into the dirt. It sniffed, tilted, then picked up the egg in both hands like it was made of something breakable. It didn't eat it. It just held it. Then, without a sound, it turned and ran. Not wild, not frantic, just fast. Toward Ridge Mother, who hadn't moved. The little one reached her side, stopped, turned back. And for a moment, that hung heavier than any breath Alma had held that winter. It raised its arm. Not a wave, just a lift. Just a shape in space, a gesture. Then they were gone, back into the thicket, into the green. Alma stood alone in the yard, the fog rising now, the sun climbing behind the trees. She didn't cry, not right away. But later, sitting on the porch with a second cup of coffee she hadn't planned to pour, she said a name. Caleb. Not loud, not sad, just aloud, and it didn't echo. It sat there with her. That afternoon, she walked the yard again. She checked the fence line, picked up a branch the wind had snapped loose. She didn't see Ridge Mother again. Not that day. But at dusk, she found something on the porch, tucked neatly beside the step where the wind couldn't steal it. A small bundle of switchgrass, tied with a strip of bark. The kind of bundle her husband used to make when drying feed. The same way Caleb had once imitated, laying grass in little twists to dry for fun, saying they looked like hay dolls. She picked it up, fingers brushing the knot. Not twine, not synthetic, just bark. Peeled clean and wrapped tight. She turned it over in her hand, looked toward the trees, and smiled. That night she lit a single candle. No more. She placed it near the window and wrote in her journal for the first time in days. There's a child in the woods, a young one, her young one. She paused, then wrote, I said his name, and the world didn't end. Then, beneath that, in smaller letters, some things come back to you in forms you never expected. She closed the book, blew out the flame. The dark was full, but not empty. In the morning, she'd bake again, maybe something sweeter. And maybe next time, she'd bring it a little closer to the edge. The morning came without hurry, soft and golden, the kind of light that only happens at the end of a long summer. It stretched wide across the porch, slipping through the railings like it had nowhere else to be. The sky hung pale and high, and the air tasted like dry earth and fading clover. Alma sat on the top step, hands wrapped around her knees, her flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows. The season had shifted slowly this year, and the silence felt different now, less like a question, more like a memory being folded away. For weeks, there'd been no new sap on the oak, no pine cones on the rail, no gifts tucked under stone. The little one hadn't come again. Ridge Mother hadn't shown herself either. At first, Alma waited, day after day, every footstep in the dirt carrying hope. But eventually she stopped bringing the offerings. Not out of bitterness, out of respect. Whatever rhythm had passed between them had played its part. She could feel it in her bones the way old folks feel rain before it comes. Something had turned, not away, just inward. She still swept the porch each morning, still brewed her coffee in the dented kettle, still checked the coop, even though the hens had grown too lazy for surprises. The journal on the windowsill sat unopened now, its pages curling softly in the corners, the last entry written in early June. Some things come back to you in forms you never expected. She had nothing more to add, not because there was nothing more to say, but because the saying itself wasn't needed anymore. And yet that morning, this one, something told her to look again. She stood, knees cracking like ice on old pond water, and made her way slowly down the steps. The grass was brittle underfoot, tinged with gold, flattened in streaks where deer had passed during the night. She moved past the coop, past the stump that once held her baskets of eggs and folded cloths, until she reached the spot near the gnarled oak, the stone altar she'd come to know like an extension of her own heart. It looked untouched at first. The usual moss, the darkened patch of bark where sap had once glistened like honey in winter. But then she saw it. Two things, side by side, a green Osage orange and a small metal button, round, worn, smooth at the edges, pewter. Its surface dulled with age, the kind that takes years, not weeks, not months, but seasons of being buried, weathered, lost. Alma's chest tightened before her mind caught up. She stepped closer, bent slowly, reached out one hand, fingers trembling not from fear, but from something older, something deeper. She lifted the button, turned it over in her palm. She knew this button. There had been 4 on Caleb's jacket. One had gone missing. She'd looked for it once, years ago. Thought maybe it had fallen between the porch boards when he was reaching into his pockets. Maybe it got caught in the chicken wire. snagged loose while he fed the hens. She remembered kneeling with a flashlight, fingers scraping between cracks in the boards, finding nothing but dirt and spiders. And then time moved on, and so did the search. Until now, her eyes didn't blur right away, but her throat closed. She stood there for a long while, both objects cupped in her hands, the green of the fruit soft and unreal against the dull silver of the pewter. There was no question of how it had gotten here. No doubt. No need to explain. Someone had found it. Someone who knew. Not what it was, but who it was to her. She pressed the button to her lips. Didn't speak. Didn't cry. Just breathed out a thank you so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind. Later, back on the porch, she opened the journal, turned to a fresh page, wrote slowly. Not everything lost is meant to stay gone. She didn't write more. Didn't need to. Instead, she walked back to the oak with a single piece of cornbread wrapped in linen. She placed it gently on the stone, smoothed the cloth once with her palm, then stepped away. She didn't wait. She didn't look back. That night, as the sun dipped low and the crickets began their long, steady hum, she lit the oil lamp on the table and closed the curtains halfway. The cabin smelled of dry wood and old coffee and something sweeter. Maybe from the last jar of blackberry preserves left open on the counter. She turned down the wick and sat for a while in the quiet, hands resting on her knees, listening to the house breathe. It had become a habit, this sitting, this waiting, not for visitors, but for peace. And peace, when it came, was not loud. It didn't knock. It didn't call out. It arrived like breath in the dark. There was no sound from the woods, no rustle, no footsteps, just a presence that wrapped the yard like fog, thick and calm and unafraid. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain aside. At the edge of the trees, where the line between yard and forest had once felt like a fence, a figure stood. Not close, not hidden, just there. Not alone. The smaller shape beside her barely moved. But it was there, a little taller now, standing straighter. Neither waved. Neither stepped forward. They didn't need to. Alma pressed her hand to the glass. Let it stay there. Then, like always, they faded back into the dark. Not vanished. Returned. To something older than language. Older than grief. Older than the pain of being left behind. That night, Alma placed the button on the mantel, beside the Osage orange. Not inside a box, not behind glass. Just resting there. Open. Known. She turned off the lamp. Walked to bed. The stars outside were soft, spread out like memories too long scattered to trace. And just before sleep took her, she heard it. Not a voice. Not even a sound. Just a breath. Drawn long, released slow, as if the woods themselves were saying goodbye. Not forever. Just for now. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with understanding. Not everything we lose is meant to return in the shape we remember, and not every silence is empty. Sometimes, silence is the only language deep enough to carry what words can't hold. Grief, grace, and the quiet gratitude for being seen, even once, without judgment. There are places in this world that don't belong to time. Places where the trees remember, where breath is carried on the wind like prayer, where footsteps leave more than prints in the dirt. They leave echoes. And if you stay long enough, listen close enough, and carry yourself gently through the spaces between what's known and what's only felt, you may find that the line between us and the wild isn't a line at all. It's a thread. A thread woven by kindness, by stillness, by acts so small they seem invisible. Until they're not. This story was never about proving something. It was about honoring it. Honoring what's sacred without needing to name it. Protecting what's fragile without needing to own it. Trust doesn't always speak loud. Sometimes it only shows up in the quiet act of watching over, of returning something lost, of asking for nothing but the space to exist in peace. That's where the real miracles happen. Not in spectacle, but in restraint. And maybe the best kind of love isn't loud or grand. Maybe it's the kind that walks beside you from a distance, leaves offerings instead of promises, and gives you space to grieve without taking your grief away. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. So wherever you are, whoever you've lost, whatever you're still waiting for, know this: some connections don't vanish. They change shape. They grow deeper in the dark. They return in ways we're not always ready for, but always need. And when they do, we know. Thank you for walking this path with us tonight. If this story touched you in any way, we invite you to leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us what stayed with you most. And if you believe in stories like this, quiet, human, full of mystery and meaning, please consider liking, subscribing, and joining us again. There's always more waiting in the stillness. Until next time, listen closely. The forest never forgets.